Hi everybody, and welcome to the Australasian College of Road Safety New South Wales Chapter Seminar today. Thanks so much for joining us. Our topic today is on young novice drivers and telematics feedback to improve safety-related driving performance. We have two terrific presenters. We've got Professor Teresa Senserrick from the Centre for Accident Research and Road Safety at Queensland University of Technology, or CARS-Q as we know it, and we have Dr. Amanda Rawlinson from the New South Wales State Insurance Regulatory Authority, or SIRA. I'm Anna Chevalier. I'm from the Australasian College of Road Safety New South Wales chapter. I'm the seminar coordinator and I'll be running us through today. I'm assuming everyone can see my slides. And I'm assuming, oh, it's not working. And I'm assuming that we're also recording. So sorry, for the first time, we're running it a little bit differently without backup channels. So not used to using the technology. And yeah, hopefully everything is working beautifully. Okay, so I'm going to pass over to Duncan McRae, who is our New South Wales chapter chair, and he's going to speak a few words to welcome you in. Over to you, Duncan. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna. Firstly, for those of you who are unfamiliar about the college, and this is your first seminar that you've attended, welcome. If you're a regular, welcome back. The college, of course, is, you can see it on the slide there, our purpose is to foster communications, networking, fostering communications, networking, professional and advocacy in road safety, because our goal is to reduce serious road trauma. And we see that the need for collaboration is one of the key things we need to have in order to achieve that goal. Today's seminars are, I think, close to a lot of our hearts. A lot of us are very passionate about novice driver fatalities and serious injuries, and the topics and the information I think you'll find particularly interesting. I really thank Teresa and Amanda for putting their time in today to give us this information, which is not only relevant but exceptionally current and up to date. So that's exciting. A couple of things about today's seminar. We are recording it. That recording will be available on the national website in about a week, a little bit longer. So we'll pop up reminders around the place when that is available, so such as LinkedIn and Facebook. So you'll see that the recording's up and you can go and listen to it. The other thing I want to mention is that if you're not a member of the college, you do, by attending these seminars, get a complimentary 3-month membership that allows you to have a look at what we do. One quick last plug before I hand it back to Anna is we do have our National Road Safety Conference that last year was postponed because of COVID, but it is on again this year in Melbourne in September, and I'd encourage you to log on and find out about that, because it's a really worthwhile function. It's a blended format this year, so you can attend in person down at Jeff's Shed, the Melbourne Convention Centre if you're not a local, or you can go online and watch it that way. But today's seminar, I'll hand you back to Anna, who can give you a quick little bit of housekeeping and introduce the presenters. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Duncan. Wonderful. I'll just move on to the next slide. Okay, so the webinar runs for 60 minutes today. It includes a question time of about 10 to 15 minutes at the end. We'll have Teresa present and then Amanda and then the question time. The webinar, as Duncan said, will be recorded, and that and a copy of a PDF of the slides will be emailed to each of you in a week or so. It will also be a copy of the slides and a copy of the recording will be on the National ACRS website, as Duncan mentioned. Today we have a slightly different structure. We're going straight from the webinar. At the end of question time, we'll launch into our AGM, our annual general meeting, and you're all welcome to stay and attend for that as well. It's about another half hour beyond. I'd also like to thank not only our presenters today, but also all of the New South Wales chapter staff who helped out behind the scenes making this presentation happen. And also to making the AGM happen. If you have a question today, as you can see here, I'll just use my mouse here, hopefully you can see that, you're muted. So if you look at the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see that you're muted. You'll stay muted throughout the presentation and the AGM. But if you have a question, in that same box, if you unclick the question section, you can go down here and type in a question and press send, and it will come to us. So feel free to do that at any time. We will hold almost all the questions, if not all the questions, right till the end though. I'd like to welcome our two presenters to talk about young novice drivers and telematics feedback to improve safety-related driving performance. As Duncan said, a subject that's very close to many of our hearts. First of all, I'd like to introduce Professor Teresa Senserrick. Teresa is a professor at the Queensland University of Technology Centre of Accident Research and Road Safety, Queensland, CARSQ. She's focused her research on road safety for over 20 years, including in other Australian and international positions. Having a PhD in developmental psychology, she has a particular interest in youth and young adults, including a focus on disadvantaged youth and communities. And over 80% of her funding and research outputs follow these themes, particularly focusing on novice education, training and graduated licensing schemes. And I'll introduce Amanda now too. So Dr. Amanda Rawlinson is the manager of the CTP scheme policy at the State Insurance Regulatory Authority here in New South Wales, or SIRA, where she's worked for the last 4 years on innovation policy for automated vehicles and point-to-point transport. Amanda's worked in a range of industries in the private sector, including automotive and telecoms, as well as managing compliance and policy functions for regulators in the public sector. She has an engineering degree, holds a PhD in numerical modelling, and is passionate about encouraging innovative ways of achieving regulatory outcomes. And I'm going to pass on to our first speaker, Teresa. Over to you. Thanks, Teresa.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you. And I just briefly bring up these slides that people are probably familiar with these curves now, but just to ground us in why we're meeting about this topic today. This is an example from New South Wales from a few years ago, with showing that new drivers are really peak in their risk of crash when they transition from the otherwise relatively safe learner period into that initial few months of driving on their first independent licence. Thanks, Anna. And while that's true of all novices, there's also an age impact. So this graph is it's actually from the UK. I don't have an Australian one, but you'll see that those red lines are showing very similar risk curves by age and experience going along the bottom. On that blue line are the age groups of when people first got their licence, their independent licence. So if you look at that gap between age 17 and age 20, you can see that's where there's a bit of a youth effect contributing to otherwise a fairly consistent red line pattern of inexperience risk. Thanks, Anna. So this is to give some background on why might telematics help and understanding more about adolescent development. If you look along the top row of images there, that's a functional MRI, so undertaken while people are performing a task. And this slide is just to explain that the brain is changing throughout the lifetime, particularly because I don't like to hear that young people's brains aren't developed properly. In fact, if they are developing properly, what happens is we acquire a lot of new capabilities as a child, and it's during these adolescent years that we start to improve and focus those capabilities. And this happens by processes that you don't really need to have to understand the terminology, but trimming away the connections that aren't as useful and really thickening those and localizing those pathways that are the most efficient. And so what you see across the top there is the child has some little triggers happening in some similar areas to the adults, whereas the adolescent's in between. Why I like to use this image, it's from research from a while ago showing a studies where you are looking at a computer monitor and your task is to focus on something happening at the center of the screen and not in the periphery. So for example, a flashing light that's down in the lower corner, and asking just to focus on the center, don't look at the flashing light. And the children can do this and the adults can do this, but the adolescent brain is wired to look at that flashing light. Next, thanks, Anna. And so this graph is really showing you why is that? And there's two control processes that are developing at different rates at this time, and they're most different during the adolescent years. So you have this the top curve takes off quite quickly and rapidly, is about sensation seeking and rewards and impulsivity and distractibility, and these are the types of motivations we need as young to leave our nest and explore the world and become independent from our parents. And the line underneath is sort of the last area of the brain to go through this process is towards the prefrontal cortex, which you can see is just slowly and steadily developing along the way. And this is where we can plan, control, and make our informed decisions. And really adolescence, again, is just where those two different control processes are most separated. It's not necessarily a long period for most people. And of course, there's variability, but where those lines converge is typically not until about the mid-20s. Thanks, Anna. I think we all associate hormones with adolescence, but there is another hormone besides the testosterone and the estrogen that is not as well understood in terms of the risk for driving, and that's melatonin. And I think back in the olden days where we flew into different time zones, people were sort of coming to know melatonin as something to help us sleep. It is actually a hormone that's released naturally in the brain. And this graph is showing you physical stages of puberty, are your Tanner stages, and a clock in a 24-hour time frame. And what happens as you progress through these physical development stages, that melatonin is getting released later and later at night, so through till about 11 o'clock for some young people. So while our body's going through all these changes, the rule of the 7 or 8 hours sleep isn't really appropriate. We're needing more like about 9 hours sleep at the younger adolescents, right, when we're starting to think about driving. But thinking about not being able to get that good quality sleep till late at night, even if you are going to bed earlier and having to get up for school or work, etc., it means that young people are really out there with a sleep debt a lot of the time. And so that's probably why if you have young people, you find it hard to wake them up on days when they don't have to go out, where they're trying to recover that somewhat. Thanks, Anna. So these have lots of implications for driving, and the graph will look fairly similar to the crash curve. These are fall asleep crashes in the US. And you can see the great burden there in the teenage years. So we've got impact of fatigue, emotions, this clash with how well we control our attention. We're prone to distraction, impulsiveness. Speed management is one of those things that you have to keep on top of every second of the drive. A phone might ring, you might be out not intending to drink and you're offered drugs or alcohol. All of these things are happening in a young person's life that if they haven't paid attention to them yet, they can be making poor decisions. Thanks, Anna. And as these studies with the fMRIs continue, they're much more accessible to research now. what you find is that they're actually, what I've shown you as sort of average patterns, the brain, and that you hear about the plasticity of the brain, it's quite clear to see that there is a role for experience and environmental factors. So some of those structural changes and processes will look different across cultures or different language groups, and even comparing people from similar countries or states, but in higher and lower socioeconomic areas. So there is a lot happening there that we're learning more and more about. And again, those two processes are not really out of whack for too long. And so it is a period of higher risk, but it's not highly prevalent that all young people therefore go and drive crazily on the road. Yes, those people stand out. But it's also true that not everyone matures through those processes, not even past the 20s and 30s. So again, contributing to some of the higher risk adults that we see on the road as well. So I think that concept of individual differences is important to remember and not think about all young people painted with the same brush. Thanks, Anna. So contributing to that also are the lifestyle factors that come during the adolescent years. Compared to adults, young people are more likely to be out at night, on weekends, with their peers as passengers, for recreational purposes in older and smaller cars. And these are higher risk for nearly everyone. There's even some research to suggest that, you know, high rewarding peers for adults could be impairing driving ability as well. And next slide. And then there's the inexperience that's faced for all new drivers. And some of the things that we see are particularly just not managing how closely they're following, and not in a sense of tailgating, but just that little bit too close, not choosing their gaps well, not looking at all the right places at the right time, although hazard perception training and testing is really advancing that. And again, the travel speed for conditions, learning that it's not just about the speed limit, but many other factors control when you might need to be going slower. Thanks, Anna. So where does feedback fit in? And again, I think people are fairly becoming more familiar with this concept of a higher order of skills when you're learning to drive. This is the Goals for Driver Education from Finland, showing that at the bottom is the basic vehicle manoeuvring, and then getting into manoeuvring in traffic. And these skills on average take about 15 hours for most novices to gain those basics. And it's then that we really want to look at how do we now make them safe, and therefore the Australian way of going for more like 100 and 120 hours of practice at this time is thinking more about the context for the drive, if you should be driving, and more of the personal goals for life and skills for living level. And I think we've got better at looking at these first two columns all the way up the scale, but it's really this last column that we're sometimes lacking, because again, not all young people are the same, and really personalising learning and making it individual is what's really important at the top of this hierarchy. Thanks, Emma. And this is what feedback can offer. It's one-on-one, it's in the coaching literature versus instructing and training, but trying to individualise the learning. And it's also common in school-based research of young people in education generally. And what is shown is that feedback that is timely, it's objective, it's specific, and it addresses consequences is the most effective. And in that student population, having some more detail rather than just some basic feedback is also very helpful for learning, with some fairly large effect sizes there, up to about an 80% role of feedback in learning outcomes. And there's been some series of research going on in this format. I'm not sure who we have here on the webinar, but many of you might know Alexandra Krasnova, now Malloy, and supervisors went back at the time of her PhD, Brett Molesworth and Anne Williamson, have done a series of studies looking at self-explanation and reflection training programs, and found that feedback had a really critical role. And I'll show you a bit more in a minute. Thanks, Anna. This is just to give you a few more context, because without calling it feedback or in the telematics vein that has developed recently, there are some early simulator studies, for example, that look at an alert that comes up with young people if they're looking away from the forward roadway too long, that have increased attention, or explaining close following. Although again, with a simulator being a one-off hit, that might not be improved. The improvements might not be sustained over time. Whereas more the advance of systems like DriveCam, which had cameras and alerts happening directly to the driver in the car. These really took off in the US, where drivers generally starting at very young ages, at least 16, and therefore having reports to parents as well. And certainly these systems have shown to decrease those extreme G-force events that these technologies monitor, particularly going around a corner too sharply. And we know that those curves are one of the major crash scenarios for novices as they're learning to negotiate speed around different curves. They've also shown that they work better if the young person is told that if they improve and stop getting alerts, their parents won't get a report. But these programs are really hard to sustain, because in very busy lives, you know, as Anne McCart would say, the parents who needed to look at these reports, they really needed to, were not the ones that were looking at them sometimes. So they've been really hard to get them into any long-running programs. More recently, Natalie Watson-Brown has looked at another form of feedback in terms of the professional instructors with learners during their driving, that rather than just reacting to what's going on then and there, giving that higher order type of feedback about how that relates to when you're driving on your own, and how something that happens in one situation transfers to other situations, and what the young person can learn from that as a learner. And in its early phases, as found in the self-report surveys from young new drivers, that those that had more of this type of higher order driving instruction reported reduced inattention and intentional risk-taking behaviour. Again, mediated by a self-regulated safety orientation. Thanks, Anna. So back to the New South Wales group, for those of you in the New South Wales chapter, the main thing to look at in this graph is the blue line at the top is the control situation of people coming back in the simulator to start with, and all the lines underneath are showing that speed was managed and kept at lower than the control, even up to 6 months post-training. There was some form of individual feedback provided to the participant. And the next slide is the next study along, taking this onto the road. This is an 80-kilometre speed zone, but very similar results were found, although that green line is just the alert of the beep, you're going over the speed limit. There has been some research to say that once young people feel confident enough, they might turn their radio up so they don't have to listen to that. But yeah, those who are getting more individualised feedback were, with more information, were much better able to manage their speed. And this series of studies has found similar results for 50-kilometre zones, and also the time spent over the speed limit rather than just the mean speed. Thanks, Anna. And so that pretty much brings to hand over to the next speaker shortly in why can telematics help. And I've just noted that there have been some other incentive and some insurance or pay-as-you-go type incentive trials that have been run. And these are finding that the feedback alone is reducing the risky driving, and that it's potential for this to be even greater with a financial incentive. And Mark Stevenson, many of you will know, has just had accepted a paper on a large Australian randomised control trial that looked at a composite measure of speeding, harsh braking and harsh acceleration, and also found substantial reductions due to the telematics system. So last slide, thanks Anna. So in conclusion, there's healthy neurobiologically driven development, as well as lifestyle and inexperience factors going on that are inflating the risk for young drivers. And most of them are out there intending to drive safely. And it's really this individualized feedback that really helps if it aids the self-reflection and the self-regulation required for them to become safer drivers. And telematics provides that opportunity for that sort of feedback and incentive with all those best practice elements of being timely, objective, specific, detailed information, and consequences in terms of if there's incentives or financial incentives, etc. And I think I just have the last slide with my contact details. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa. That was a really fascinating presentation. And we've had a question or two come through, and we'll come to them at the end after Amanda's presentation. So I'm going to pass over now to Amanda. Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks, Teresa. That was super interesting. So today I'm going to present to you some of the key findings that we found in our young drivers telematics trial. Thanks, Anna. The young drivers telematics trial then was the largest randomized control trial evaluating the effects of telematics on young driver behavior. As some of you might already know, prior to the trial, there was a lot of anecdotal evidence about the benefits of telematics, but really no published large-scale control trials for young drivers. So in July 2018, SIRA and the New South Wales Centre for Road Safety launched this trial with three objectives in mind, really to investigate whether and the extent to which telematics can positively influence young driver behaviour, to identify any opportunities for and barriers to broadening the use of telematics as a means of improving road safety, and as a way to understand young driver behaviour through the extensive collection of some real-time data. Thanks, Anna. So the trial itself then, over 700 young drivers aged 17 to 24 participated in the trial, with the majority of those participants being from Western Sydney, Outer Sydney or regional New South Wales. There were three distinct components to the study. There was a 6-month randomized control trial consisting of one treatment and one control group, so roughly split into 362 participants in the treatment group and 355 in the control. We did a pre and post intervention study, so 100 participants from the control group began to receive feedback after 3 months of driving, and then we did a pre-intervention and post-intervention comparison of their driving behaviour. And then we did some attitudinal research, so a number of surveys and focus groups to explore the participants' experience and interaction with using the telematics device, any motivators, barriers or concerns to the using the device itself, and their likelihood to take it up if telematics was offered by a government or a motor vehicle insurer. Thanks, Anna. So participants were recruited through an open expression of interest page boosted on social media to target the users that we were looking at. Participants were taken through an onboarding process, including gaining their consent and verification of their vehicle compliance. Participants in the treatment and control groups were randomly selected, and participants were sent a telematics device in the mail. So what they received was a data recorder, a light ray which changes color with their driving behavior, and an app to be able to access trip data, driver scores, and fuel efficiency info. The control group received just the LED dashboard display, which didn't really change color, and they had an app with some limited information. So that's fine, Anna, thanks. So you can see then the driver feedback that they received. if we could zoom in on the app-based, the first one, Anna, they had a range of real-time and deferred feedback for the data group. So you can see there, that's the sort of app-based feedback that the control group were seeing. So they had a leaderboard to compare their driving with other participants, and the ability to review their trip summaries to see where they might have made a mistake, and a driver score. If we could go to the next one, Anna. Beautiful. The treatment group that got the real-time feedback from the light ray, this changed color when they were speeding or making harsh maneuvers. And let's have a look at the next one. The control group then had none of the access to driver score, trip summaries, or scoreboard data, but they had a limited amount of information about fuel economy, really provided to maintain their user engagement over the 6-month period. Thanks. So we used a number of proxy indicators such as frequency and severity of harsh braking, acceleration, turning, and speeding as outcome measures. These indicators were compiled from the relevant road safety literature with the help of the Australian Road Research Board, so a big thank you to Anna for that. While they're not measurements of a crash per se, they are commonly used as lead indicators for potential crash risk. And using these proxy indicators as the basis of comparison, we compared the driving results of the treatment group and the control group for the entire 6-month period. Next slide. So we've got here some of the results that we saw with those comparisons. So we based on a comparison of 15,932 driving hours for the treatment group and 10,485 driving hours for the control group, we saw that the treatment group was substantially safer overall. However, it should really be noticed that the difference between the treatment and control groups did converge over the 6 months, which suggests that young drivers were less influenced by the feedback towards the end of the trial. So we can take a quick look at that. It's a little difficult to see. We'll zoom in on the first graph. And in terms of speeding behaviors overall, the treatment group you can see sped less frequently over that 6-month period. So on average, 38.9% lower rates of high range speeding. So that's over 20 kilometers an hour over the speed limit. And the next one, they had 10.9% lower rates of medium range speeding. So in that 10 to 20 kilometer an hour. We also then noticed in the last slide that the even when the treatment group was speeding, they tended to exceed the speed limit by less. Perfect. So we found then in terms of braking, acceleration, and turning, the treatment group also had substantially better performance in those aspects. The difference between the treatment and control groups for braking, acceleration, and turning was also more consistent across the 6-month period. So we'll take a closer look. On average, across the 6 months for that first graph, the treatment group had 42% lower rates of harsh braking events for both extreme braking there over 0.75 G, and the next one, similar results for between half a G and 0.75 of a G. Thanks, Anna. Excellent. And then the third one, on average across the 6 months for rapid acceleration, the treatment group had 25% lower rates of rapid acceleration. And the final one, they had 24.1% lower rates of harsh turning events. So moving on then to the pre and post intervention study, we saw very similar results in that component of the trial, with participants performing better in the period when they were receiving driver feedback compared to the baseline period when they didn't have any feedback. Next slide. So in addition to looking at all of that telematics data, we also undertook the surveys and focus groups to look at barriers and opportunities for broadening the use of telematics. We really wanted to explore how young drivers felt about using telematics devices, how they could be encouraged to use it, and the degree to which they were supportive or concerned about any use of those devices. So if we look at the first graph there, in terms of their general perceptions, 75% of the participants believed that it had a positive impact on their driving behavior, and 74% felt that it helped them to drive in a safer manner. And then next, we also found that most young drivers could be motivated to use a telematics device in various ways, the most obvious being discounts on insurance and registration, as well as opportunities to win prizes for good driving. However, the group which chose to participate in the trial also appeared to be highly motivated by simply wanting to be a safer driver, so it's probably worth recognizing that. And then finally, there were some interesting results among the group when it came to questions around privacy and other concerns associated with telematics. Nearly 3/4 of participants believed that more drivers should have telematics installed in their car, and a similar level thought it should be made mandatory for risky drivers. We also found that 9 out of 10 participants surveyed didn't have any major concerns about insurance companies accessing their driving data, provided it meant that they could receive a discount. Similar levels of participants said that they would not be concerned with the government having access to this data as long as they weren't identified. So then moving on to their concerns and frustrations, most participants didn't raise concerns about using a telematics device. 55% of them chose not to comment or said that they had none when asked, do you have any concerns with using a device? Of the remaining 45% of respondents who raised concerns, 17% of them related to privacy or tracking or access to data. 9% were product improvement suggestions, 7% were related to distraction, 4% were related to validity and accuracy of feedback, 4% were related to connectivity issues, and the final 3% were related to the design and ergonomics of the particular device that we use within the trial. Whilst participants cited privacy and data disclosure as areas of concern, they didn't really appear to be preoccupied by it. And evidence suggests that any privacy concerns that they had could be overcome if data was de-identified or if participants were provided sort of incentives through insurance discounts. And then moving on. The trial results then that we received suggest that young drivers under the age of 25 are receptive to these devices and would be a suitable cohort for intervention. Given their general openness towards new technologies, their more liberal attitudes towards privacy and data sharing, and also their tendency to drive older vehicles, which are unlikely to have unlikely to have inbuilt OEM telematics capabilities. Just a point of reference, I guess around 40% of vehicles in New South Wales are registered that are registered to drivers under the age of 25 are more than 10 years old. So on the other side, there were high levels of user attrition and no evidence that that behavior change that we were seeing is sustained beyond the 6-month period. Other drawbacks were that participants reported the real-time feedback was a bit of a distraction and had a low willingness to pay for these sorts of devices. So in conclusion, if we can move on, Anna. Beautiful. The overall body of evidence gathered from the telematics, the young drivers telematics trial suggests that telematics use has an overall positive impact on driver behavior. There are some significant challenges to achieving wide-scale adoption. User attrition, one of them, around 50% of participants had stopped using their device by month 6, which demonstrates that users will stop using the device unless there were compelling and ongoing incentives for them to continue. Furthermore, it suggests a need to ensure that driving feedback provided to drivers remains relevant to them. So on this front, maybe the use of gamification or micro incentives to maintain that user engagement could offer a potential solution for managing some of that user attrition. optimizing the use of push messaging to encourage further behavioral change. It wasn't really focused on, and really only in a very cursory manner in this trial, but worth considering maybe for future opportunities, or maybe using some other nudge techniques that could assist with extending and sustaining their driving improvements. Driver distraction, around 17% of those participants indicated that real-time feedback had distracted them for driving tasks. In most cases, this distraction was reported to be a passing issue, but needs to be further considered, particularly if there is the potential for other adverse consequences of providing real-time feedback to drivers. Based on the analysis of participant feedback around the driver distraction, this could possibly be further improved through improving the device ergonomics, secure stowage and brightness of lights, as well as clearer and more upfront communication regarding the potential risks. And finally, the last challenge to overcome would be the willingness to pay. Over half of the participants stated that they wouldn't have paid for their own telematics device. 3 out of 4 said they were likely to use one if it was provided by the government or an insurance company, suggesting that adoption rates will remain low unless telematics can be supplied at low or no cost. However, probably worth noting that even in countries with mature markets where telematics usage-based insurance policies are in use, they're very much still in the minority, and around 5% in the US of motor insurance companies have opted into this telematic style policy, suggesting that maybe the cost benefit is not really there for insurers. And then finally, for anybody who's interested, the full report is up on SIRA's website, so please pop on there, have a look at it. It's a really interesting read. And that's it from me. Thank you, Anna.
Just go back to that one for a moment. Thank you so much, Amanda. That was fascinating. And it's really good to hear detailed results of these big studies that tell us so much about how effective these kind of systems are for young people and what some of the issues are. Thank you to both of you for bringing all your expertise to today's presentation. So now we have time for some questions and answers. We don't actually have many questions, although we do have about 65 people on the line. So one of the questions is for you, Teresa. It says, for novice drivers, is there any benefit to educating them as part of the GLS, or how to understand and manage those amygdala hijack scenarios?
Absolutely, because as you can see that these processes that are going on doesn't mean that young people have absolutely no control over their brains. It's just bringing attention to that and being aware of limitations and impulses and attention. So certainly there is increasingly more attention to this in education programs around graduated licensing and other forms of education. I also, if I could just respond back to Amanda's presentation, going back to the very first graph I showed, those 6 months are the most risky. So even if that's the attention span for young people and parents to pay more attention about being safer for 6 months, that has potential. That's potentially all it might need for them to develop those good habits in the beginning, because they are getting a lot safer past that time. Sorry, Anna, I didn't mean you needed to show it.
That's okay. It is a pretty crucial graph, isn't it, for all of us? And it's a good reminder of just how dangerous that period can be. Somebody else has asked, is Mark Stevenson's paper yet published? Is it possible to get a copy of it?
I really just spoke with Mark yesterday and it's just been accepted. So potentially there'll be a corrected proof online. I did notice that I'd missed putting some references at the bottom of some graphs, so I will put them in for the slides that go out. Happy to do that.
Terrific, thank you. Sounds like a good one to watch out for, Mark Stevenson's paper. We have another question to you, Teresa. It says, thanks for a great presentation. What age and licence proficiency did studies refer to? Was it mainly learners?
I guess I showed a range of studies. It was really focusing on those new independent drivers, that red P phase for the most part, although reflecting back on time as a learner as well. For example, those series of studies in New South Wales, really the target group have been young people around 17 to 25 is what we often focus on in Australia, given that the graduated licensing systems sometimes have a little bit more leeway after about age 25.
Great.
Did I miss the part to that question? Sorry.
No, I think you got it all. The question, I'll read it again, but I think you covered it all. What age and licence proficiency did the studies refer to? Was it mainly learners?
Yeah, no, mainly provisional.
Yeah. Another one, this one's for Amanda. What are the distractions that telematics produce?
So I think there was some feedback around the light ray potentially being a little bit too bright and those sorts of things. They were fairly low key in terms of the distractions that the participants were seeing, I think.
Okay, and we have another couple of questions coming in just now. One's for you again, Amanda, I think. It says, why is telematics popular in other countries but not in Australia?
So I think probably, like I say, it's got a fairly low uptake in insurance across the world, and that's, I think, goes to that continued engagement of people within the CTP scheme. It is tricky because whilst the young drivers have the potential to be influenced by telematics devices, they are already fairly heavily subsidised within the scheme. So having that sort of incentive there probably doesn't exist for them. But I think it's probably fair to say that the uptake is probably not that great. The cost benefit just isn't there for the insurers.
Can I jump in there? I wonder, Amanda, if this more recent research will be providing a bit more evidence-based ongoing. I know I spent a bit of time in the US, and there was a scheme over there, not telematics, a different scheme that it seemed to be actuarially justified because people who opted in did go on to have good records. Now that might be because they were going to be the good drivers anyway, but at least it was a motivating factor for young people and parents to really think about it and pay attention to what was happening in those early months. So I think it'll be interesting to see if this evolves over time with the latest developments.
Absolutely. Look, we're very keen that you know, if it's going to work, that that the insurers and the industry pick that up. So it's super interesting to see how that develops.
Thanks.
Okay, so another question for Amanda. I understand that drivers using these devices had to expect no consequences of being caught speeding unless there were external speed camera. Is it correct to assume that even higher effectiveness, if the data would be shared with insurers who could increase premiums for bad drivers?
That's an interesting question. Probably something that we'd need to take a look at the data for. I think one of the barriers to that might be getting people to adopt this new technology if they think that there's going to be a penalty involved with their driving behavior, as opposed to something that gives them a benefit. So there's certainly that tension there with having that alternative approach.
Okay, I've got another one here. It's a long one. I haven't quite read it all. So again, it's for you. In your presentation, there was mention regarding insurers not recognising a cost benefit from novice drivers using telematics. Did SIRA receive any response from Australian insurers regarding the report? And how did how did you see insurers having a role incentivising novice drivers through making insurance more affordable?
So certainly we have had some discussions with our insurers, and I think it's probably important to draw the distinction between compulsory third-party insurance and a sort of a general motor insurance for this. So there are certainly some challenges to implementing these sorts of devices within our scheme. They seem to have more of an impact internationally in a sort of a compulsory policy, a comprehensive type policy instead of a compulsory type policy. The Motor Accident Injuries Act actually does allow these sorts of devices to be used if necessary, and if our insurers can come up with a way to make it work, we're very supportive of that.
Okay, only a couple more questions. One is, what was the name of the device used in the SIRA trial?
It was actually a GoFar device.
Okay.
And there's some more details. If you take a look at the report, there's some more details about the device itself.
If telematics is not an option, what better alternative exists for improving, and they haven't gone on to say it, but I assume they meant improving young driver safety?
What an excellent question. I'd love to know.
Teresa, maybe you could jump in there.
Yeah, look, a lot of this space involves parents, because even though we are started driving a little bit older in Australia compared to some of those US studies, still at age 17 and 18, parents play a really important role, and guardians generally. And I think there's a perception that once the young people get to that sort of adulthood, that they're not paying much attention to their parents anymore, and they might give them that impression. But actually, research suggests that parents are the most trusted source of information, and letting your values known, and having an open communication, if you can, with your young person, even if they don't look like it, they'll be paying attention. So I think following up on a previous question too about would penalties about speeding help with the trial, what has happened in the pay-as-you-go type studies that have happened overseas, it's been the other way around, that you start with a high premium, but if you're not speeding, if you are reducing your risky behaviours, the premiums go down. So again, as Amanda said, those reward type approaches are much more motivating and engaging for young people. So thinking about rewards that can be offered to young people and other incentives is good from a family perspective. But if we're talking about statewide initiatives, really sticking with the graduate licensing systems are there for a reason, because they do work. If you're in a jurisdiction where there's not peer passenger restrictions or night driving restrictions, and some of those circumstances I mentioned earlier, trying to bring in those systems that reduce exposure to risky scenarios is really important. And having parental monitoring of those just casually with young people without being too much of a helicopter parent, but just checking in with them, and general things like knowing where your young people are when they're not at home and when you expect them home, and a general idea of what they're doing, which to some people might seem obvious, but actually that doesn't happen all the time and not in all families. Some of those basic things are really highly predictive of keeping young people focused on safety and being more averse to extreme risk taking.
Thanks, Teresa. Some of your words are very reassuring for those of us who are parents. Okay, so we do have a few more questions coming through. One is, has SIRA considered a rego discount that's equal to the telematics cost? Did the study consider that?
It was a discussion that was had, but there are some challenges with that. particularly around funding those sorts of devices, and whether that would actually address some of those issues about participants like losing their engagement after the 6-month period. So I think there's certainly some additional work that would need to happen around that driver distraction, around that that user attrition before that could even go anywhere.
Okay, we've got another question. Given the great results from reductions of crashes, would it not be in the government's interest to give incentives to insurers to make these mandatory for new drivers?
I think that it is a broader issue that needs considering. There is a lot of useful information that we got from the trial. It certainly didn't address all of the issues around user attrition, and I think it's really important that the government considers fully the implications of these sorts of devices before it commits to those sorts of things. So, you know, if those issues around user attrition just haven't been addressed as part of this study.
Okay, have you, another question is, have you compared your information? The question isn't full actually, so I assume they're saying the findings from the SIRA study with any other similar apps, such as, and they don't go on to mention particular apps.
Not quite sure what the question means, just around compared with similar apps.
Yeah, I guess this, I think what they're trying to say, although it's a bit difficult to know, is have you compared the results with outcomes from other types of trials of telematics feedback devices?
Okay, so well, I'm not sure that there are that many trials that were directly comparable. Certainly the details of the study itself and the comparisons that we did is in the report in full, but I don't think that there was anything that we could actually compare with, if that's the question.
Okay, I need 2 more questions. So one is, and we're right on time actually, you mentioned the use of telematics in other countries, and then it says what other countries have, and again it peters off.
So the one that's at the top of my mind is the US. We did do a bit of a study. Off the top of my head, I'd have to take another look at the report to see exactly which countries do it. It's a bit sporadic.
Somebody says Italy, US, UK, South Africa.
Thank you, somebody.
Okay. And there is one final question. It says, how much did the study cost?
I'm not sure that's something I have on me, or would probably need to check whether we could share that.
Yeah.
I certainly don't know off the top of my head.
Wonderful. It sounds like anyone who has more interest in the study should have a look at the report, which is quite detailed.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much to both of you for joining us and sharing with us the wealth of experience and expertise and knowledge that you have in these areas. Really such a fascinating presentation from both of you, and you know, amazing that you were able to address all of those questions as well. We really appreciate it, and I think, you know, it will tick the box for a number of people who have been very interested in these kind of studies, and in what we can do to address young drivers who are at risk, at higher risk of crashes. I'm just going to flick through to the end of the slides. I want to thank you.
All the best with the AGM.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank all of those who have attended so far and invite you all to stay on for the AGM. It will probably last 30 minutes or less, but yeah, you're very welcome to join. We'd love to have you. Thank you so much, Amanda and Teresa, again. And I'm going to pass over to Duncan to kick off the AGM. Thanks, Duncan.
Thanks, Anna. As the committee will know, my motto is a quick meeting is a good meeting, so I'm hoping the AGM won't go for 30 minutes, but if it goes that long, I'll be surprised, but nevertheless, let's kick into it.